So welcome everyone. My name is Anshul. I'm your host. And today I have with me Rahul Poruri. Rahul is a head of software at Soft Circuit Labs, and he's also the CEO of FOSS United. And he's an advisor for an NGO called Sarian Vigyan Foundation. Rahul graduated with a dual degree in physics from IIT Madras, and he was a scientific software developer at Enthought, where the famous libraries NumPy and SciPy were created. So thank you, Rahul, for joining us today, and thanks for doing this conversation with us. I'm really excited to discuss tech policy and FOSS with you.
It's my pleasure, Anshul. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Great, great. So before getting started, I just wanted to, start with a small story about a guy called Daniel Stenberg. I'm probably you've heard of him. Daniel Stenberg is the creator of the open source tool called Curl, right? And Curl is probably today used, according to one estimate, it is used by more than 1 billion users today. And Daniel has been, and he's the single sole developer and maintainer of that code, and he's been doing it for more than 25 years now, along with his full-time job, right? And I was reading his blog, and it's funny that since Curl is used so widely, whenever there is a news of a vulnerability or any bugs in that tool, companies and organizations reach out to him blatantly, and then they notify him, and they expect him to fix those things promptly, as if Daniel owes them immediate support. So on his blog, I just read out two sentences which he wrote in his blog. He says, most of the days I tear my hair when fixing bugs, or I try to rephrase my emails not to sound old and bitter when I once again try to explain things to users who can be extremely unfriendly and whining. I spend late evenings on Curl when my wife and kids are asleep. I escape my family and rob them of my company to improve Curl even on weekends and on vacations, alone in the dark mostly with my text editor and a debugger. So that's the plight of an open source developer, but I'm sure it's not so bad. And you've been an open source developer for quite some time. So we'll start with that. What's your experience developing open source software in your a decade of experience?
Yeah, so funnily enough, I stayed away from programming for most of my college life. I failed my first basic computer science course in college, and after that, I went nowhere near programming for about 4 years. And eventually, for a summer project, a professor asked me to analyze some astronomy data, and I was very interested in astronomy academically. And the professor just told me, I don't care what programming language you use. I don't care what you do. I just need this data to be shown in this visualization. And he told me, like, I know that Python is used once, so maybe you'll have an easy time picking up Python. And that's how I got started using Python. And that's how I got started using NumPy and SciPy. So I was using a large amount of the scientific Python ecosystem for almost 2, 3 years when I was in college, towards the end of my college. And after that, I joined Enthought, and I started contributing almost immediately to some of the open source packages that we maintain. Enthought created open source packages, multiple open source packages over the last 2 decades, and some of them we still actively use to be able to build our customer solutions. And I started contributing to open source packages. So when I say contribute, all I was doing was simply open issues about bugs. I was trying to run example scripts and pointing out issues with the example scripts. I was fixing issues with the example scripts so that they actually run. I wanted to highlight this because a lot of people don't consider this contributing.
Right.
But things can have humble beginnings, and all of this is very valuable and meaningful contribution. So yeah, I think in the first couple of years of my work life at Enthought, that is what most of my contributions were. I was looking into the documentation, trying to fix minor issues with the documentation, the example scripts, the tutorials, those are the kind of things that I was mostly involved in the first couple of years. And then slowly I started reviewing pull requests by some of the other maintainers, some of my colleagues. I started working on addressing some of the bugs myself and fixing them. Maintenance work, over the last 10 years, I've seen us move from Python 2.7 to Python 3.4 and then 3.6 and now 3.9. So, and with every Python change and with every new versions of dependencies, there's a ton of with small but still meaningful maintenance work that needs to be done. So I was working on some of that maintenance work. I was doing some of that maintenance work for some of the packages. And yeah, eventually I started contributing larger features that we were adding to the packages. During COVID, we got an opportunity to spend almost an entire year overhauling some of the open source packages. And yeah, we spent a year. I led about a team of 3 or 4 people where we just went across all of the open source packages that we were using. We implemented fundamentally new features that were going to help us continue writing software for the next decade or two. Remove a large amount of technical debt that had accumulated over like 5-10 years. So it's that is how my journey has been. And then after that peak, it's gone back down to, yep, I'll review a PR here and there, I'll fix a minor bug here and there, I'll do some minor maintenance here and there. That's what my experience contributing to and maintaining open source packages has been.
Right, right. Great. So the next thing that I wanted to, bring in is the whole idea of the value of, free and open source software, and that's what FOSS stands for. And I had attended one of your presentations in Takshashila Institute as part of our a conference in a course that I'm doing there. And what caught my eye was, of course, one of the very first slides where you mentioned the size, the supply side value and the demand side value. And it not just, it runs into trillions, the value of FOSS. So could you just throw some more light on that, how valuable the FOSS is, and then of course the estimation challenge of FOSS?
Yeah, I think just to repeat some of those numbers and just to define the terms again, the study specifically talked about open source value by calculating how much it will cost if all of the open source in the world just completely disappeared and it had to be recreated. And they put a rough number of maybe a few $1 billion, like $5 billion, if all of the open source that existed today just completely vanished, and we had to hire people full time and pay them to be able to recreate all of these things. So again, I think one key thing to note here is the study is saying that it will cost $5 billion if we were to pay for this. But most of that $5 billion of work is being done for free right now. Right. Most of that $5 billion worth of work that has gone into creating these open source packages was all done for free by volunteers, by people who are working at companies where the open source project is being maintained, and like you're not directly getting paid to maintain it, you're just sort of maintaining it on the side on your free time. So that is the supply side value, where if the thing disappears and we have to spend time to hire people and recreate the whole thing. The larger and the more valuable number to look at is the demand side value. So all of us use a ton of products which use open source software under the hood. In some cases, maybe you're directly using open source software like Mozilla Firefox. So what the study then did was, let's assume that there's no such thing as open source software in the world. That there is no concept of open source software, and all of the software that a company will need to be able to build their products, all of the code underneath, all of the dependencies, they will have to write for themselves. Every company independently of each other.
True.
And yeah, the study came up with a number somewhere in the trillions of dollars, trillion with a T.
Right.
And again, that makes sense because the open source packages that these people have created are being used across domains, across industries, across companies, small and big, and the value that it is providing is absolutely incredible. It's sort of like saying, yeah, freshwater streams go away, so now everybody has to capture water from the air and create it themselves. It's sort of like that, where if open source as a concept just completely disappears, then it will cost the global economy trillions of dollars, potentially running up to tens of trillions of dollars. So that are those are the kind of numbers that we're talking about in terms of what value open source is actually providing to the global economy. It's not often that we talk about some of these numbers because there aren't enough people studying these kinds of things. And I think only I think now there is a shift in academia itself where there are more and more people who are trying to study these kinds of things. And I think we'll keep getting better and better numbers here. Hopefully, people can do deep dives into finance, into manufacturing, and they can talk about what value open source is providing to these specific industries and specific domains. So, yeah.
Good, great. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that paper with me. I haven't got a chance to completely read it, but I went through it. I browsed through it, and one of the things that struck me was the whole idea of knowledge commons, right? Which is like a parent of open source software. And the paper mentions the work of Garrett Hardin, where this idea, which is more popular in social sciences and in economics, is the tragedy of commons. That was more in terms of physical resources, but when software came in, it became more relevant. And I think precisely one reason what I understood was because there is no precise way to put a finger on the exact value which open source software creates, and that kind of leaves in the category of that commons, that everybody wants to exploit it, but nobody really wants to replenish it or build it or maintain it. But this whole idea of knowledge commons was very new to me very recently, and it should have been obvious now that I know about it, that there's so much knowledge in the world has been built by people who never cared to patent it or copyright it or protect it, right? The whole field of science has progressed because of it. Imagine if Einstein said, that I won't disclose my idea to anybody.
Yeah.
Would you like to add some more about it, the whole idea of knowledge commons?
Yeah, again, Anshul, I fully agree with you. Like when I first came across knowledge commons, I was just completely blown away. So, funnily enough, I think the path to even coming across that term and this entire field of study was more or less the entire reason why I started the Takshashila public policy course. I clearly set out in my own mind, and I think in my cover letter for the application, that I want to understand the economics of open source software. I want to understand the policy angle of open source software. I want to understand how it is being exploited, how it fits into the existing frames of study, of academic study. And yeah, I mean, after many months of just meandering around all of these things, I eventually ended up on Knowledge Commons. And again, like you said, like it was sort of just an aha moment when I first came across it, because yeah, open source software, open hardware initiatives, open data initiatives, open science, which is very close to my heart, given my background in physics. And in general, just any sort of literary work that is available for public, like all of Wikipedia and the entire Wikimedia project. All of that is a part of the Knowledge Commons. And the interesting the reason why I think we need to have a separate thing for it is exactly what you mentioned, Anshu, which is it's everybody wants to exploit it. It's a I forgot the economic word for it. It's non-exclusionary, where it doesn't matter how many people use it, uh, and one more person isn't going to diminish the value of this thing. But at the same time, everybody is using it, but it's not contributing back to it.
Right.
People are not trying to think about how do we maintain. So knowledge commons as a field of study, I find very interesting because I'm hoping that again, it is going to help us understand how do we sustain knowledge commons, how do we sustain open source projects and all of the other initiatives. Because at the end of the day, these are all helping technological innovation and progress. There's just absolutely no way around it. I like what you just said. Like Einstein comes up and says, "I figured out the theory of gravity, but I won't tell you." Now give me money and I will tell you. So yeah, absolutely. It's those kinds of things which trying to hold back information that is beneficial for the global economy. Just because you want to make some amount of money in the short term, I think it just doesn't make sense.
True.
And more we can understand the long term benefits globally of the creation and sustenance of knowledge commons, the better tools we will have to be able to tell policymakers, tell industries, tell academics, hey, here is what we need to do. Here are the changes we need to be able to sustain these things. So yeah, I find that space very interesting, and I hope there's more academic work in the knowledge commons area in India, especially as well.
Right.
Given our interest in ensuring that we are able to provide social equity, knowledge commons is going to have a huge role there. And unless we in India start studying some of these things and the value it provides and what we need to do at a policy level, I think, yeah, we will not know what to do unless we start studying some of those things.
Right. Right. Yeah, I want to now little later, I want to drill down on this intersection of open source software and policy, and I wanted also to understand it better. But before that, I'm also very curious about what FOSS United is doing, specifically your role in FOSS United. What's the purpose of FOSS United? And yeah, so if you could shed some more light on that.
Yeah. FOSS, for people who don't know, stands for Free and Open Source Software. And FOSS United is a non-profit, it's an Indian non-profit, not-for-profit entity. And our aim is to promote and strengthen open source software, FOSS, in India. That is the broad aim for the not-for-profit. Some of the ways that we do that is by giving grants to new open source projects that are coming out of India.
Okay.
We funded a number of projects over the last 4 years. The not-for-profit was registered in 2020. And yeah, we're only 4 years old. I've been volunteering with the not-for-profit for roughly a year and a half, 2 years now. I think right after I finished my public policy course, I think I came over in December and I attended a meetup. And yeah, after that, I've just been a regular in the community after 2022 December. So yeah, some of the ways that we promote and strengthen the open source ecosystem in India is by giving grants to open source projects. We organize meetups in cities for professionals and also for students, where we again talk about open source across domains, and across fields. We are organizing student clubs so that we're able to inculcate that spirit of hacking and help them understand the value of open source software right from when they're in college, or even before, hopefully.
Right.
Apart from, we run events, annual events where we are trying to bring everybody together into the same place. It's sort of like a celebration of open source software that has come out of India. And also, it's not just about open source software. We have had speakers talk about open hardware initiatives in India, how open data is playing a key role, how the technology policy in India is shaping the technology today, and how we can then shape public policy as a whole. So those are some of the things that FOSS United does. And one of the other key things that FOSS United is working on is trying to work with the government of India to, again, strengthen and promote open source in India. The government of India already has a law on the books which talks about procurement of open source for e-government initiatives. The law very clearly says that for any new government initiative, the government has to prioritize or choose open source alternative before a closed source alternative. But the thing is, from what we've seen and what we've heard, it's not exactly being implemented on the ground, and
Hmm.
it's not. And again, this is just one of the problems. There's a lot of other things that the government can do, and we would like the government to do. So that again, the government is also promoting and strengthening the open source community in India. So we are trying to work with the government and the different departments in the government, both the union government and the state governments, to try and strengthen and promote FOSS in India. Those are the breadth of activities that we do at FOSS United.
Great, great. Yeah, on the government level, I can, now that I've started learning economics, I can see that the layperson word corruption, it's actually economics word for that is rent seeking. And the moment you remove incentive from the transaction, somebody's buying, procuring a proprietary software, and there is a transaction involved. Of course, there are incentives involved for the state agents to make profit out of it. And the moment you move to open source software, that maybe that incentive is gone. So of course there will be a pushback from the system as a whole. So that could probably would be one challenge.
So funnily enough, I was talking to somebody over the weekend who has actually been on the ground and who was uh, uh, to draft some of these tenders and who has worked on actual software procurement for the government. And she was talking about the fact that in some cases, it's what you said, it's rent seeking from people within the government. In other cases, it's just inertia from the vendors.
Right.
Because open source, yes, open source exists, but somebody needs to then take that open source software and be a vendor to it and set it up in the meaningful way to the government.
Right.
And there's an established vendor base in the country for e-government initiatives, and that established base, like, we've not been able to incentivize them to adopt open source software. Because they already have their entire workforce trained on certain technologies. They're just happy to continue doing it. And why would they by themselves go and say, yeah, okay, fine, we'll upskill all of our people to adopt open source technologies without any financial incentive for doing it?
Right.
So these are some of the things that we're trying to think of, like, because this is not a like single place problem, but this is a problem across the board within the government, from the vendors in the procurement process itself. And we're trying to talk to stakeholders who actually have experience with some of these things so that we're able to better understand these things. And again, we can understand where specifically in here do we fit in. And how can we contribute? Like, we don't want to become vendors ourselves. We just want to provide advice to the government. We don't want to become vendors ourselves, but we can help vendors get upskilled. We can provide guidance to the vendors to know where they can get upskilled. We can bring together a community of people who can act as the bridge between the government and the vendor, where the vendor needs people to hire from our community. The government needs experts to be able to comment on something. Yeah, get the expert from our community. So that is the kind of thing that we're trying to understand now. The public policy initiative is the nonprofit itself is new, and the public policy initiative within the nonprofit is even newer. So we're trying to work out all of these things while also causing as little damage as possible towards ourselves and the policy work overall.
Right. Yeah, I can understand. So a few days back, I was reading this book called "In the Beginning Was Command Line" by Neil Stevenson. And in the very first chapter, he does a brilliant comparison. So the book was, I think, written 25 years back when Apple was still the iPhone, iOS, these things had still not come in. So mainly it was Microsoft was ruling the world. And he does a very good comparison between, Microsoft is like he's selling the OS, Windows OS. He compared it to a station wagon. It's like very stable, very nice. And across the street, there is the Linux stuff, right? So there's Linux is available for free, and he compared it to a Batmobile, right? No, it's like fully featured, fully loaded, everything possible, very secure and free. I mean, it's like on the across the street, there's like a Batmobiles ready to fly off the shelf for free. Go and pick it up. But still nobody was willing to buy, because then very first question was, if something goes wrong, who do I reach out to? And in Microsoft, I have customer care support. In case of open source, who do I reach out to? And then he reasons that, you don't have to reach out to anybody. I mean, from Microsoft, there'll be one guy on the phone. In the Linux side, there'll be 100 community members will be ready. They'll jump with you. They'll work with you. They'll come at your home. They'll fix it. Analogy, right? And still people were not convinced because, as you said, the inertia, the whole idea of business transaction, that the whole world of open source software, this paradigm was new. And what they was happening there in US at that time, maybe a similar inertia is there in government today. So I found that very interesting, that analogy between a station wagon and a Batmobile, right?
Yeah, no, Mahendra is an excellent writer. I'm sorry, I'll just go into a bit of a tangent.
Yeah.
But yeah, even today, we are very surprised, but also we sort of understand that a very popular activity in the student clubs that we help run are Linux installation parties. The student base is just getting together. There's a few people who are running those student club. Those people are helping the student base just install Linux on their machines.
Right.
And one of the problems, at least from my experience, again, like I was one of these people where I installed a bunch of different Linux operating systems on my machine, kept ruining the installation every 6 months, one way or another. This is again like 15 years back now. And I was like, yeah, okay, I don't have anything on my machine that is pertinent. I'll just wipe the entire thing and reinstall from scratch. And that was okay for me. And I had the time and energy and the mental capacity to be able to do these things by myself. And I also had quick and easy access to people where I just go to the next door, knock on the guy's door, and he was operating on the bleeding edge. He was somebody who was using Arch Linux again 15 years back. So he's using Arch Linux 15 years back. So any problem that I run into, I go knock the guy's door who's right next to me, and he fixes most of my problems. But I think that is still lacking for a lot of people. In most tier 2, tier 3 colleges, local government departments, sure, I can come and help you install something, but the operating system itself isn't enough. You need applications on top of it. Okay, fine, I'll come help you install some of these applications. Okay, you install the application, but I have no idea how to use LibreOffice. I've been taught how to use Microsoft Word in college, and for 4 years I picked up how to use Microsoft Word. Now you're asking me to switch over to LibreOffice. I think there are some people who don't have as much of a mental barrier to overcome, but for a lot of people, for a majority of people, I think there's a reasonable chunk of mental barrier that they need to overcome. And we're trying to figure out how we can be there throughout their journey instead of just showing up at the beginning, saying we'll install Linux for you and then disappear.
Right.
So let's figure out some of these strategies where we'll go, yep, let's do an Linux installation one weekend, let's install LaTeX another weekend, and we'll teach you how to create these absolutely beautiful typeset documents, and we'll install some other open source thing on the Linux installation the weekend after that, and we'll figure out how to use those things. So we want to be able to get people comfortable working in a Linux environment, because otherwise, like we get enough people to install it, and then a week later they're like, yeah, okay, I have dual booted back to Windows. I've never touched my Linux installation.
Right.
Yeah.
So in your experience and knowledge, are there, so we're talking about India, but specifically all over the world, are there countries, developed economies where this, especially in the government administration, this open source is actively used, promoted, encouraged?
So I think the US and Europe, more than the US, have been doing a lot to promote open source adoption within the governments.
Okay.
Recently, I came across so the US has an organization, a government entity called USDS, United States Digital Services. I think it comes under the president's office. So USDS is an organization which I think started around Obama's first term or second term, but they were going around and helping other organizations adopt digital technologies, and in some cases completely digitize them, not just adopt digital, but become digital native departments. But and they should talk about open source in some of the talks that they have, but they weren't sort of highlighting the open source packages that they're using. And I don't remember them uh, giving back to the community in terms of paying the open source projects or anything of that sort. The US EU right now at least has a thing called Open Source Observatory, and this seems to be an across the European Union initiative where they're trying to identify how open source is being adopted at the grassroots level. And they're trying to bring that up to a European Union level so that it can then be spread to other countries and other parts of the European Union. That seems to be, at least in my mind, open source adoption starts by just talking about how you're adopting open source. Supporting open source starts with just talking about how you're using open source. Once you start talking about it, then we can start thinking about, okay, we've identified all the things that you're using. Now let's talk about how you can support them, how you can financially support them. And at least in that place, in terms of identifying and communicating very publicly and as broadly as possible how open source is being used on the ground, the European Observatory seems to be doing Open Source Observatory seems to be doing a good job. Apart from that, I'm reasonably sure there are a bunch of other places where open source is being used heavily. I just got reminded of this because of the geopolitical situation. But China is very heavily relying on RISC-V.
Okay. Chip.
Yeah, RISC-V ISA, instruction set architecture, if I remember correctly. I'm not a computer scientist, so please forgive me if I got that wrong. But yeah, RISC-V ISA, after the recent not embargo, sanctions, after the recent sanctions by the US on China, this is funny for me when I first fully understood it, but the way US sanctions work is not only is there a sanction on things which are created in the US and are exported to China, but there's a sanction on anything which was created in the US, which is used in a machine, which was then used to manufacture something which went to China. So, for example, most of the equipment that is used in Taiwan to be able to manufacture these chips at TSMC has US made components in them. So now Taiwan and TSMC has a problem exporting things to China because Taiwan and TSMC can't adhere to the sanctions if they start doing these things. And from what we've heard, again, these are all things that were like very new when we were doing the public policy course before December 2022. But even before that, China was beginning to explore RISC-V. And after these sanctions started coming in, they have been heavily investing at the state level in RISC-V. To a point where now they do have production grade RISC-V chips which are being used and which are being sold and used in computers and everything of that sort. So, and again, like RISC-V is relevant here because RISC-V is an open source instruction set architecture. So those are some of the ways in which we are seeing nations very heavily rely and promote and invest in open source software. I think like I'm not I still briefly mention India, but then again India has a very spotty history in some ways. I think the best and the worst example is the METI website, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. The METI website has a page on major FOSS initiatives. The very first link in the page is about NRC FOSS, which is the National Resource Center for FOSS, which was set up a while back, I think in the mid 2000s or maybe 2010s. And that was meant to be the nodal agency in the union government to be able to coordinate FOSS activities, FOSS adoption, and anything and everything in between. That website link is dead.
Oh.
On major FOSS initiatives. So coming to good news, CDAC, which is the Center for Development of Advanced Computing, which is again a government initiative. They create an open source Linux distribution called Boss Linux. If I'm not wrong, it's built on top of Debian and it comes pre-installed with a bunch of applications. It comes pre-installed with language packs. I think 16 different Indian languages are pre-installed with it. But then again, initially before doing the course, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And after doing the course, I was wondering, why is CDAC of all people doing this? Why can't this be a community initiative? Like, why can't they just give it away to the community and tell people it's pretty straightforward to skin a Linux distribution and throw a few extra things into it and release an ISO, if I'm not wrong. I have not done it myself, but this is my understanding. So I'm not sure why a government agency is doing it. So it's really interesting because every once in a while there are things that I come across which I feel very proud of, and then all of a sudden I get hit with something and I'm like, why is the government doing this?
Yes, public policy that way offers a great framework to think about what government should do, should not do, if they have to do, at what level, at what intensity. So that's a great learning for me also as I started exploring the world of public policy. Next thing I wanted, to pick your brain on. So last week on the FOSS United forum, I saw this thread discussion about FOSS United's and that community's effort to develop a tech policy charter, and that sounded very interesting to me. And I can see people have started discussing that. There is first draft also ready for people to work on. So maybe you could help us understand that what's that initiative?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, we are a not-for-profit, but the not-for-profit is just because we want to be able to take donations and use that money to do some good. At the core, we are a community organization. We are a bunch of people who are all interested in open source software, and there's a few people who are active volunteers who are trying to corral all of the people who are interested in open source software to get together and talk about it. That at the end of the day is who we are. And over the last 1-2 years, the way that we've gone about public policy is we've been we've had so my mentor so far has been this person called Venkatesh Hariharan, who was previously the public policy director at FOSS United.
Okay.
He's somebody who comes with more than a decade or two decades, 2+ decades, if I'm not wrong, hands-on experience with public policy in India.
Okay.
He, in his previous life, he was a journalist, and he moved into public policy. He started working at Red Hat in India, and then Google and a whole bunch of other places. And Venkatesh, Venki was the one who was the point person who was taking decisions about why we have a stance on a certain public policy initiative and what our stance is. And at a certain point, we realized that, again, because we're a community organization, the community needs to be made aware of what our stance is. We need to work together with the community to understand what all of us together want FOSS United's public policy initiative to be.
Right.
We don't want it's not even a question of aggravating someone in the community, but it's more of a question of proactively communicating to them and keeping them aware of why we are doing what we are doing in the public policy space. And we felt like putting together a tech policy charter, a public policy charter for FOSS United, and again putting it out as soon as it's a V0 to get the feedback from the community was the best way to go ahead with it. Venki is no longer the public policy director. He is a part of the community now, as he was before. And he's, again, going to help us put together this charter. He's going to provide comments on the charter. And as a member of the community, we want his feedback, like we want everybody's feedback.
Right.
We want people who are tech experts, and we want people who are public policy experts in the tech space to be able to comment on these things.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to do. We are trying to bring the community together so that we can all identify what we want to do, and how then we go about doing it.
Right.
Because we don't want the community to feel like uh, we are being reactive, and every time the government puts out a public policy that is tech adjacent or relevant to tech, we don't want to have to think, should we comment on this or not? Is this relevant to us or not?
Right.
Is the position that we are taking, is this what the community's position is or not?
Right.
All of these things are the reasons why we felt like now is the right time for us to put together a public policy charter. And again, it's not like this document is going to be set in stone. We want to keep this evolving, because as the policy landscape as a whole evolves in India, we need to also evolve the charter with it. As the community evolves, we need to evolve the charter with it. But we want a strong foundation to be able to start from, which is why we are saying, yeah, let's start, let's put this together, let's get the community's feedback on it, let's create this public policy charter together as a community. And then once we have something that can form the foundations, then we are able to easily think about, hey, yeah, this public policy is coming out, this is our position on this. So it becomes fairly straightforward for us to be able to say, yeah, this is what our position is and this is what we'll communicate. Those are some of the reasons why we are trying to put together the tech policy charter.
Now that we are talking about tech policy, since you've thought about this topic for quite some time now, would you like to explain the role of tech policy, especially when it comes to the role of the state, and how state-driven tech policies have intended and unintended consequences in last few years? If you'd like to talk about, take any specific example so that it's more concrete to understand that, what exactly is tech policy, how it affects this. So in the world of public policy, we have this Samaj Sarkar Bazaar, right? The markets and the state and the society, and how technology itself is a big driver of change. And then when it is given in the hand of government, without a solid knowledge body or a solid framework to think about how should be designed, what kind of effects it does have on the society and the market. So if you could take an example.
Yeah, I think over the last 1.5 years, I've more or less only been thinking about it. I am not going to call myself a public policy practitioner, because that I am definitely not a public policy practitioner. I am somebody who reads up a little, thinks about it a little, and talks to people a lot. And yeah, in that context, there have been a few things that have happened over the last couple of years since the Takshashila course that I find very interesting and are perfect examples in my mind. Let me sort of again, I think I'll just not go in any chronological order. I think I'll just pick random instances. One of the other scholars, I think from the previous batch or maybe the one before that, Shri Kumar, he gave a talk at Chennai FOSS earlier this year, where he talked about the government spending money creating RISC-V chips.
Okay.
And because again, like RISC-V is a big thing. India sees how much China is spending on it. India sees how important RISC-V is becoming across the globe. So India put in a bunch of money to help academia create a chip. I think in CDAC as well, they created a chip. And Shri did an excellent job of breaking it down and pointing out the good and bad. He was able to say that, okay, good, the government gave money, but the problem now is that money could have been put to better use, in the sense that that chip which came out, it is in no way competitive with existing x86 chips. It's just not. It's not competitive with the existing ARM chips either.
Okay.
It is barely competitive with the other RISC-V counterparts that it has. And at best, it can be used sort of as a prototype to be able to like figure out how you could build something on the RISC-V architecture and how you could use RISC-V chips to be able to build your system. But it is not something that can be put into production. He was talking about, I think the government has the capacity to be able to think about the big picture where they see that, okay, RISC-V is a big thing and we should give money to it. But at the same time, the government doesn't know about the nitty-gritty details. It's just not possible for the government to know about it. And some of the nitty-gritty details that they missed out on, that Sri was excellent at pointing out, was the fact that the documentation around the chip is like close to non-existent.
Okay.
The kind of information that a usual chip manufacturer is going to provide to a user is close to non-existent for this chip. And these are the kinds of things where the government and the technology sector sort of clash, where the government wants to do something, it has good intentions. Let's not assume malicious intentions. Let's assume that they have good intentions, but they're ignorant. They just don't know.
Right.
The government, the principal secretary is not going to know, the Meitei minister is not going to know that there are documentation that needs to be created for these chipsets, and here is how the documentation needs to be, and here is how it needs to be communicated, and so on and so forth.
Like
And
announcement from Meitei, I heard that they said they put out a notice saying any LLM which comes out has to be approved by Meitei, and then I think they retracted it, realizing what a big blunder that was, right?
yeah. Uh, 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 no, that's a perfect example. I'll move to that next. We recently, I think in May, not I think in May in Bangalore, I helped organize a panel discussion on technology policy and why technologists should care about public policy in India. And one of the panelists was Anvesha Sen, who is a public policy practitioner at a company called HasGeek.
Okay.
HasGeek is really popular in the tech space. Practically every software developer in the country knows who HasGeek is and what they do. And she was talking about the fact that the tech space is very binary in the way that they react to public policy. Either they don't react at all to the things that the government puts out, or there's a huge amount of outcry and outrage. For example, like when the Meitei put out this thing about all LLMs being approved by Meitei. And like because of that huge amount of an outcry, the government backed off. But our reaction to this can't be binary either. So, for example, one of the things that came out sometime in the middle was guidelines on dark patterns.
Okay.
So the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, surprisingly enough, we were like really surprised, like, okay, like why is the Ministry of Consumer Affairs doing it? Actually, it makes sense because they're trying to look out for the consumer and the consumer of any marketplace.
Right.
So the Ministry of Consumer Affairs put out the draft guidelines on dark patterns, and they specifically identified dark patterns which are prevalent in the industry.
Right.
And they talked about penalizing some of these things. And there again, I think the fact that there was no very clear policy in some ways incentivized people to exploit consumers. And eventually when the government did come out with it, I think the industry should have celebrated it. The industry should have celebrated it and very and should have been very outspoken about the fact that this is an absolutely amazing thing that the government came out with. It would have been great if the industry could have come out and point out newer examples that the government should actually include. It would have been better if the industry came out and talked about specific ways in which these dark patterns themselves are being circumvented in some cases by companies to be able to create even newer dark patterns. Etc., etc., etc. So there's a ton of interesting things which the government is doing. I think the great thing about the dark patterns guidelines that the Ministry of Consumer Affairs put out is it is really small and tiny.
Okay.
It targets one very specific thing. It lays out the guidelines in a very clear way. It defines what dark patterns are and provides examples in a nice and concise way. And it's extremely readable to a lay person. The way that I was going around talking about the dark patterns bill was just by I took the PDF file and I was presenting that PDF file and I was forcing the audience to read that PDF file with me. It's barely a 10-page long PDF file, and we were just going through the examples of the dark patterns, and we were talking about the kind of guidelines and what fines are going to be imposed by the government if they catch an online marketplace use some of these dark patterns. And yeah, I feel like that is a perfect example, because like any good policy, they attacked one specific thing and they were very nice, clean, and concise with it. And that's it. You want some other policy that is general to e-marketplaces, we'll create a completely different policy. We are not unnecessarily going to pollute this. And we need more of these kinds of things where they're able to they're able to limit the attack area, the target area to a specific thing as much as possible. Solve just that problem, solve it nicely and cleanly. Don't be don't have too much regulation, but at the same time don't have no regulation at all.
Right.
Yeah, I think the dark patterns guidelines are an excellent example that I think everybody in the country should actually read, just so that they can understand and they can get over their mental blocker about reading a public policy document.
That's good. That's a great insight. This is turning out to be such an interesting conversation. I want to, just keep going on. There are so many other things that you mentioned. I want to double click on, drill down, but I think in the interest of time, we'll have to wrap it up. Just before closing, if you would like to, if viewers of this podcast, if they want to get involved with FOSS, with FOSS United community and FOSS in general, what are some of the things that you would recommend them to do? In what way they can get involved?
FOSSunited.org is where we hang out, the FOSS United community. We have meetups in a bunch of cities, so maybe come by and say hi one of these days. We have a forum, we have a very active, for me, too active of a Telegram channel, because I'm not able to keep up with all of that communication, all of the things that are going on the Telegram channel. Apart from that, FOSS United is a very small microcosm of the larger FOSS community in India. There are tons and tons of, again, on the ground open source communities in India that just, like, because of lack of capacity, don't interact with one another.
Right.
So look around where you are, see if there is an open source community near where you are, so that you can just go and join them, and see if there's an open source community relatively close to where you are, and see if you can go join them. So when I first started becoming involved in FOSS United, I was living in a town called Anantapur in Andhra, and that's about 4-ish hours away from Bangalore. And
Okay.
I think for 4 months straight, on one Saturday every month, I would leave around 6-7 in the morning, drive to Bangalore, 4 hours, attend the meetup, try and leave as early as possible, which is still going to be 6 or 7 p.m., and then drive back to Anantapur.
Wow.
But I was just so deprived of the kind of intellectual conversations and the kind of community aspect that FOSS brings, that I was willing to do it. I was more than happy to drive 4 hours each way to be able to attend a meetup once a month. So again, like, look around you, maybe you'll find a city nearby where we have an event, or there's just an open source event happening. There's an open source community which is active. If not, see if you want to start it. Because in our experience, we've realized that over the last 4 years, there has just been so much demand for open source communities across the country. Just absolutely across the country. We've heard from people in Kolkata, people in Dehradun, we've heard from people in Jaipur, not traditional places which you think of when you tell people tech software. And that's because there's just an absolute, like, there's such an absolute demand for open source communities and technology communities at the grassroots level. So if there isn't a open source community in your town or city, and if there isn't one nearby, reach out to us and ask us if we can help you put one together. I can reasonably tell you that as soon as you create one together and hold an event, people will start flocking to you, and you'll be able to have a recurring meetup, which will just keep going. I started the Hyderabad chapter for FOSS United. There's a ton of open source things that happen in Hyderabad. It's not like there isn't anything of this sort happening. But we wanted to do something different. We wanted it to not be domain specific. We didn't only want to come and talk about Kubernetes. We didn't want to only talk about AI. We didn't only want to talk about Python or Rust or any other language. We
Yes.
wanted to talk about open source across the board. We
Yeah.
wanted to talk about open hardware. In fact, Hyderabad has been really interesting because we've had people come and talk about open data.
Okay.
We've had people from the National Remote Sensing Center, which is the center of ISRO, come and talk about how open source is being used in Earth observations.
Wow, that's very
And
yeah.
so this is the thing. I feel like every city has people who are actually getting work done using open source.
Right.
It's just that we need to expand our horizons a bit and say, you know what, open source isn't just front-end development, back-end development, or AI. Like, let's just talk about where all open source is being used to solve problems.
Right.
We had an amazing session by someone called Rakesh Dubdu, who runs a company called Factly. And right before the elections happened in Telangana, we asked him to come over and we asked him to talk about open data in government, the Telangana Open Data Portal. We asked him to talk about the elections and we asked him to talk about open data in the context of elections. And like he just did a whirlwind tour of all the places where this information exists, the Central Election Commission and all of their websites and where information is accessible. And then he talked about the Association for Domestic Democratic Reforms, ADR, and all the open data that they have. And it's I think we need to expand our horizons a bit and talk about all the different ways in which open source is helping us solve problems. And I think if you expand your horizons to that level, you'll always find people who are interested in joining you, interested in talking about something, and just get together and have a fun time.
Great, great. That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Rahul, for taking out time today and having this discussion. I hope I'll get another opportunity to catch, because there are quite a few things I wanted to, discuss with you. One of them being the absurd patent of the day or the week, which I wanted to talk about that because that has some very funny, interesting anecdotes there. So I hope I'll get to catch up with you again very soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anshul. Thanks a lot for inviting me here.